Hi, everyone, and welcome to every episode of VeggieTales Reviewed. I'm that media guy, and I'm here to answer your questions about the quality of talking Christian vegetable television. Today, we have the subject of
Episode 14 Esther, the Girl Who Became Queen. Now, if you know anything about the Old Testament of the Bible, I probably don't need to tell you that this is yet another VeggieTales adaptation of a Bible story. This story, in particular, in fact, is probably one of the most famous of the entire Old Testament. Heck, in the Catholic Bible that my late godmother gave to me for my first communion, it has two books dedicated to Esther, with one telling the traditional Hebrew version of the tale, and the other telling the Greek version of the story. And why does this story stand out among the rest? Well, to be completely honest, and I am not at all sexist, but in my humble opinion, this story is notable because it is one of the very few stories in the entire Bible that has a woman as the sole protagonist. In the behind the scenes video for this episode, which you can go check out on my channel right now, shameless plug, Phil Vischer said that one of the impetuses for creating this episode is because Big Idea got a lot of letters stating that the show was lacking episodes with female protagonists. Because yeah, the show hasn't really had any up to this point. Well, except for Madame Blueberry, but she wasn't exactly a compelling female character for a majority of the runtime. And while I can understand the desire to see at least one episode with a likable female lead, the fact of the matter is that the Bible simply didn't give the VeggieTales crew much material to work with. That is not to say that the Bible doesn't feature a number of women, but their stories are largely important because of what the men around them did, like Rahab's importance in the story of Joshua, or the importance of all the Marys in the story of Jesus. They are important for sure, but ultimately, the stories belong to the men and the women supplement their adventures. And by the way, this is also the case in stories that Big Idea largely wouldn't want to touch in the first place because the women in those stories do some pretty despicable stuff, such as Salome and Herod's story, Jezebel and Ahab's story, Jael and Aber's story, and Delilah in Samson's story. Yes, VeggieTales does have an episode that does feature the story of Samson, but Delilah is cut out of that story for obvious reasons. But anyways, when it comes to the stories where women really do the heavy lifting, there are really only two of them. Outside of Esther, the only story there is, as far as I am aware, is the story of Ruth. VeggieTales would later tackle that story in Duke and the Great Pie War, but that episode is a much more loose adaptation of the story. In fact, the title Duke and the Great Pie War was changed from its original title of Princess and the Pie War, meaning that the episode title no longer makes any reference to women at all. Heck, in that episode, Ruth and Naomi don't even go by their names, having them switched out for Petunia and Nona instead. But that's all I will say about that episode for now, as that is a review for another time. In this episode, not only do the characters from the Bible retain their original names, but they keep the majority of the beats from the original story, including the part where Queen Vashti got kicked out, although she is not named Vashti in the episode. In fact, she is not given any name in the episode, as she does not appear outside of the first scene, so I guess that is something that she has in common with the head scallion that is totally not named Sedgwick. And on top of that, the episode includes the scenes where King Xerxes would have been killed if it wasn't for Mordecai foiling the plan, and the humble guard eventually getting a reward for it directly from the guy who wanted to kill him. Except in this video, it's not death, but banishment. Although in the scene where the queen shows up in front of the king uninvited, the king tells Esther that that kind of behavior is normally punished, and Haman says, yeah, by death or banishment. This is the only mention of death in the episode, which makes you wonder if this mention was simply a forgotten holdover from a draft for this episode that mentioned death a lot more, but was ultimately scrapped because we can't have characters talking about death on a kid's show, let alone actually putting people to death. Although death would later be mentioned in episodes like St. Nicholas, A Story of Joyful Giving, just to name one example. But getting back on track, with this episode keeping all of these elements from the original story, it sure has a lot of ground to cover. In fact, this episode does not have countertop segments or a silly song, making this the first episode of the series to be lacking both of those elements. Even Rumor Weed still had a segment at the end with Larry Boy and Alfred talking to the audience about the moral of the show, complete with a Bible verse that had become a standard at the end of every episode. In fact, the only episodes before Esther to lack a verse were the sing-along videos, which weren't trying to teach the audience anything, and The Toy That Saved Christmas, which actually had a character read from the Bible. According to the commentary, the silly song and countertop bits were cut out due to time constraints, which I guess is fair. Granted, I'm not sure how time constraints factor into an episode of a show that is not made to be syndicated on network television, but I am guessing that resources that would have been dedicated to adding the countertop segments in Silly Song were dedicated to the production of Jonah instead, as the film was knee-deep in production at the time, and Big Idea still wanted to get these episodes out in a timely manner. But speaking of which, this episode feels like a test for Jonah, in that this episode is designed to be much more dramatic and serious than your standard VeggieTales fare. Even though this episode does not have countertop segments, it does have a framing device in the form of a faceless narrator, who talks in a way that makes it feel like this episode is paying homage to The Godfather, which is quite possibly the most iconic R-rated film of all time. Now, don't get me wrong, this isn't a mafia movie by any means, but it also doesn't have Bob rolling his eyes at the What Have We Learned song as Larry interrupts him to say bamboo 3 times. In fact, for the second episode in a row, Bob isn't in this episode at all, and again, it's hard to not take that personally. And while Larry is in the episode, he hardly has any lines, and when he does speak, he does not at all act like the Larry that we've come to know and love. He is the scribe in this episode, and outside of him giving a 2-word greeting to the queen, his only lines are in one scene where he recites the events of the day to the king, just like what happened in the original Bible story. And whenever the king does have a question for him, his responses are only 1 word long. It really feels like they intentionally cut back on the silliness for this episode, and Larry was the main victim of that. Of course, that is not to say that this episode does not have any silliness. The banishment that I mentioned earlier is to the island of perpetual tickling, and the scene where the king is killed involves trying to drop a piano on his veggie head. There are still elements of VeggieTales' signature humor in here for sure, but overall, this episode is trying to be much more cinematic in preparation for the company's first film on the silver screen. So because of all of that, this episode must really stand out. Right? Well, I have to be honest with you all right now. Believe it or not, even though this episode has a lot of unique elements that make it prime review material, this script was quite possibly the most difficult one for me to write for this entire series thus far. Is that because this episode is bad? No, not necessarily, and I'm not saying that just because I want to try to avoid blowing my load too early. This episode does have its funny moments despite the more dramatic tone. There are still music numbers that, while not the best the show has to offer, are still good, and the episode does largely succeed in making the episode feel more grand than usual due to its more dramatic moments and stronger cinematic presentation. This episode is definitely not in the same ballpark as Madame Blueberry or The End of Silliness. However, while it is by no means the worst episode of the show up to this point, it might just be the least interesting episode so far. And I'm sure that sounds pretty strange considering all of the unique elements that I mentioned, and that's why this script was so hard for me to write. I really struggled to figure out why this episode left me feeling the way that it did. And after thinking about it for who knows how long, I finally found my answer, in the form of a 5-year-old asparagus named Junior. Now, if you've seen this episode, you might be thinking, well, that doesn't make any sense because Junior is nowhere to be found in this episode. And that is absolutely true. He does not appear at all in this episode, and therein lies the crux of my complicated relationship with this episode. This is the first episode of the entire series to not feature him in any capacity, and I don't think that enough people realize just how important that is. In a show that was created around the purpose of teaching biblical morality, Junior serves as a very important role as the audience surrogate. Sure, he is far from the most complex character on the show, but he never needed to be, because not only is he supposed to be more of a blank slate when compared to the other characters so that the kids watching can have an easier time putting themselves in his shoes, but he is also, a kid. And a 5-year-old kid at that. I think this episode is trying to imply that Esther is a child, if the title referring to her as a girl is any indication, and in the Bible story, I believe that Esther is presumed to have been a teenager. But in biblical times, teenagers by and large filled the role of adults due to how short lifespans were back then, so I can't imagine that Queen Esther was that much younger than King Xerxes in real life. And besides, I don't really want to imagine that, because an adult king making a child his queen just gives me some really weird feelings. But even if I was to put all of that stuff aside and just look solely at Esther and how she fills the role as a child character, if that is what she's truly supposed to be, I simply don't find Esther to be as compelling of a character as Junior. The thing is, even if Junior did not tell us his age in the first episode, it still would be incredibly obvious to the audience that he is a young child. He talks like a kid, sounds like a kid, acts like a kid, and is limited in his knowledge of the world just like a 5-year-old kid. This makes his mistakes come off as more understandable due to his lack of understanding on how the world works, and his childish mannerisms come off as charming because he is still going through a lot of development. I can see kids finding Junior not just very likable, but also very relatable for that reason, which is exactly the point of an audience surrogate, and it's easy to see parents appreciate Junior due to what he is doing for their kids. In comparison, Esther does not act like a kid, but she does not have any strong personality traits that an adult would have, making it hard for both kids and adults to fully engage with her. On top of that, in stark contrast to Junior, she never makes any mistakes. Sure, she does get scared about doing the right thing at points, but she always knows what the right thing to do is, and she ultimately always does it. I'm not saying that Esther had to be deeply flawed as a person in order for this story to work, but since there's already very little else to her character, providing some sort of character building through mistakes that would allow Esther to, actually build her character would have helped. And maybe that wasn't possible due to the constraints of working within the events of a real life story, but still, they could have given her some obstacle to overcome. When looking at Big Idea's previous Bible story adaptations, Dave had to overcome his lack of height and his family putting him down for that reason. Joshua had to do what was right while stuck between a wall and a slushie. Daniel had to do what was right in the face of death. Same goes for Rakshak and Benny. Junior had to overcome his racism in the story of Flibero Lou. And King George was a very flawed character who caused the conflict in his episode. In this episode, Esther effortlessly becomes the queen, and everybody loves her, so what's stopping her from doing whatever she wants? Yeah, it's established that Queen Esther approaching the king in his throne room uninvited is a no-no, but it never feels like Esther is actually in any real danger from the king because we have never seen the king be even remotely hostile towards her. Heck, she mentions that she is afraid because of how the Peony brothers showed up uninvited, but the king did not seem even remotely bothered by their sudden appearance until they literally tried to kill him. Them showing up uninvited on their own seemingly had no impact at all, so the rules seem inconsistent between what we see and what we are told. Now, is it unfair of me to pin their inconsistency against her character? Well, maybe, but it is a point against this episode in either case. Her being afraid to confront the king on her and her family being banished has no logic behind it, especially when you consider how low the stakes are. And that is another issue that I have with the episode. Although, to be fair, I am not sure how much of this I can pin against Big Idea in this case. I might not be a huge fan of this episode, although again, I don't necessarily think that it is bad, but I am a huge fan of the original Bible story because of how inspirational it is. The queen saving her and her people from death in the face of death itself is truly awe-inspiring, almost like a precursor to what happens in Schindler's List, which is my favorite film of all time, by the way. In this episode, the big punishment is getting banished to the island of perpetual tickling. Yeah, it's silly, but it comes at the expense of the heightened stakes that made the original story feel all the more special. I get that a show that is aimed towards a younger audience can't get this dark, so again, I'm not sure how much I can fault the Veggie crew for this. But still, it is odd to have the main consequence in this episode be so silly when the episode as a whole is trying to be one of the more dramatic and serious episodes in the whole franchise. And that's honestly all that I have to say about Esther, the girl who became queen. I know that I didn't dive deep into some elements of the episode like the songs, but honestly, considering that this review should be the second longest review that I've put out so far, I would simply rather not spend extra time diving into the other stuff that I only lightly touched upon due to the fact that I found them to be good but unremarkable. And, to be completely honest, that is how I would describe this entire episode. I know that, again, this review is on the longer side, and a good chunk of this review sounded like I was ranting, but that is simply because this episode being unremarkable is remarkable in and of itself because of how this episode is trying to be remarkable in just how different it is. Unfortunately, the most notable differences on display here are in what was removed instead of what was added. And while the removal of the countertop scenes and Silly Song aren't too significant, as the show has removed them for specific episodes before, the fact that Larry is in the episode but with all silliness stripped away from him does feel a bit jarring. Maybe instead of the episode having him as a scribe where he hardly gets to do anything, the episode could have had a segment in the middle of the episode where Larry does something silly for Xerxes and Haman as the court jester. It didn't even have to be a song, something else silly in the vein of an act like the Forgive-O-Matic would have worked just as well in my opinion. At the very least, that form of silliness would have worked better than some of the silliness that we actually got, even though, again, I understand Big Idea not wanting to make the episode too dark. And Esther not being particularly effective at being an audience surrogate or an interesting character does put it below all of the other episodes where Junior is prominently featured, especially since, again, nothing else in the episode is significantly bringing it up. So, all that being said, I would call this a fresh episode, but it is my least favorite of all of the fresh episodes so far. It might not be as bad as a rotten blueberry or a sour cucumber, but this episode still presents us with a newly picked, but still somewhat bland, actually, what kind of vegetable is Esther? According to the Big Idea Wiki, she is a leek, but still, the episode not making that clear might be just a touch disappointing. Not as disappointing as Uncle Mordecai being a grape and not a blue jay with a raccoon best friend, but that's neither here nor there. Anyways, this has been the 14th episode of every episode of VeggieTales Reviewed, where my goal is to review the entirety of the series designed to let everyone know that God made them special and he loves them very much. Tune in next time to hear me talk about episode 15, Lyle the Kindly Viking. Until then, thank you so much for watching, click the red button to subscribe, and have a fantastic rest of your day doing whatever.